All right, y'all, it's confession time. One of the reasons I play D&D and I love tabletop role-playing games is because I love combat. I love the elements of the game that revolve around the combat, regardless of what system or what genre it is, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, or anything in between, whether it is Dungeons & Dragons, Car Wars, Battletech, Star Wars, or any other role-playing game that I've tried. I love the combat. I love that part of the game. I love describing what happens in combat, and I love having that described to me, whether it's the other players or whether it's the DM. And I kind of came across something today. It was a comment in a Discord server that I'm a part of that told about a DM that didn't do that. And I couldn't understand it. So I need to talk about this today. If you want to hear some of the great stories that I have experienced in combat and descriptions of that, I can stick around for a moment here while I kind of share my thoughts, and then I'll share some really cool stories. So let's get into this. I cannot even imagine being part of a game in which there's no descriptive combat, where maybe one player or two players out of an entire group is sort of describing what happens in combat, and where the DM basically says, okay, what did you roll? And you tell them what your roll, your roll was. They say, okay, 23, that's a hit. What's your damage? And you say, okay, I do, 8 points of slashing damage. And the next thing they say is, okay, great, is there anything else? And that's the end of your turn. That's essentially what was described in this chat on Discord today. And wow, I don't even know what to say. Like, I know because I know how I am. If I experienced that in a session, the first time it happened, I would probably be concerned. In fact, I would probably have a conversation with the DM of like, yo, is this how you're gonna run the game? Because, yeah, if that's the way the sessions went, I'd be out. I would have to bounce because that would not keep my attention. And I feel really badly for this person, this friend of mine who we were having this conversation with, because man, I mean, there's nothing worse than getting into a game and the game, you're excited about it, you create a great character that you really enjoy and you're looking forward to playing, and you get into the game, and after things go for a few weeks or God forbid, a few months, you start realizing like, this kind of sucks. Like, that's the worst feeling. And for me, if combat was missing from that, I couldn't handle it. Now, that being said, if there's no combat for a session or even 2 or 3 sessions, that's fine. I am certainly not saying there has to be a fight in every game session. Some of the best sessions I've had, there was no combat. In fact, there was even very little die rolling. There was just some really great role-playing and storytelling, and that's cool. Once in a while, that's a nice, refreshing change of pace. But the bottom line is, for me, I kind of harken back to the game. Like, for instance, whether it's like Warhammer Fantasy or 40K or Car Wars or even early D&D, I mean, pretty much the reason these game systems were created was so that you could reenact combat, so that you had a system, a systematized way that you could, play or talk or explain or express or experience combat, whether it's one-on-one, hand-to-hand like you might have in D&D, or whether it was, armies of combatants like you would have in a game like Warhammer. That's why someone codified and created these systems in the first place. And in my experience, it's only been over the last several years that like heavy role playing has really become part of the game. Like it used to be for a lot of us, it was all about combat. I mean, you could pretty much say that most of us were murder hobos. And yes, I know that there were plenty of games out there where people were more about role playing than about combat. Even so, I still feel like, at least with D&D, like a big part of the reason the game was created was for the combat. So you could sling spells. So you could, you know, swing a big giant two-headed great axe or whatever. And so if that element of the game is taken out of it, I don't know if I can handle it. And that's just the truth from my perspective. Have you ever been in a game like that? Like, I would love to hear some horror stories. Have you been in a game where the combat was flat or boring? I couldn't take it. Okay, if you stuck with me this long, then let me reward you with a little bit of story time. I'm gonna share with you 2 great stories that I've experienced through combat, through some descriptive and really fun combat. Now here's the thing. First one is gonna be one of my horror stories, let's say, or at least one of the horror stories I experienced in a game. And the other one is going to be one that was absolutely awesomeness to experience and play out. All right, so first let's start with the horror story. The horror story is this. This was back in the day. This was probably a good 30 years ago or so, back when I was in high school, playing with a bunch of my real good friends, and we were in some kind of a giant's lair or something like this. We were facing giants and we were in some great feast hall. Now, one of the party members was a magic user and decided to cast levitate on themselves and levitate up off the floor to sort of get like, you know, a bird's eye view or just a better vantage point to then sling spells from. Well, here's what happened. Brett, our DM, said, okay, one of the giants takes a spear or a javelin, whatever it was, and is going to hurl it at you. Now, if he had stopped there and just said, okay, it hits, you take damage, and that was that would have been terribly boring. But here's what happened. He said, basically, I'm using my words because it was years ago, so I don't remember verbatim what happened, but here's what I remember. Basically, the giant hauls off, chucks this spear across the room, it hits the character, I believe his name is Thaic, hits Thaic, pierces him in the gut, and pins him to the wall of the feast hall, above the door of where we need to get our butts out of. Like, that was awesome. It was horrific, horrible, terrifying, but it's like, now you're pinned against the wall and you're bleeding out. What are you gonna do? So that was awesome. Like, total horror story, not what you want to happen to your character, but man, was it fun because of the way it was described in combat. That was a horror story, and now I promised you a story of heroics. I was playing in a game where the bearded bugbear was our DM, and I was playing a bard. Had lots of fun playing this character. This was Captain Jermaine Santo. I've got some videos here on the channel you can check out all about that game and that character. Suffice to say, I love playing casters, and I love finding creative ways to use their spells. Now, Captain Jermaine Santo had access to polymorph, and at his level, I was able to polymorph myself into a giant ape. So I imagine this giant ape being akin to like Mighty Joe Young or something like this, right? And we were fighting some goblins and orcs the first time I brought this out in the game. And I said to the DM, I'm like, hey, could I try to grapple one of these goblins and like sort of like grab him by the ankles? And the DM said, sure, go ahead and make your roll. And I was successful. So he's like, okay, you've got them by the ankles. I said, okay, can I take the goblin and can I hit the orcs? Like swing it and smack one of these orcs with this goblin? And he said, all right, make an attack roll. And so I did. And so here there's this like, you know, crunch as I pound the orc with a goblin as an improvised weapon. And then the very next round, I take that goblin and I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna chuck him as far as I can out into the forest, into the trees. Oh my goodness, it was hysterical. Everybody was laughing. I had a blast playing that out in the game, and it was one of the most memorable moments I've played in any D&D game. I will remember that for years to come, if not for the rest of my life. And I'll probably be describing it for the rest of my life. And so I truly hope that you get to play in games like this, where you have that kind of fun combat where it swings from not knowing if you're gonna survive to like doing the most amazing heroic things you can imagine, because that is the fun of role-playing games, in my opinion. I want to hear all about your horror stories, and I want to hear all about your heroic stories, so tell me all about them in the comments on this video. Tune in tomorrow for some more great stories. Keep rolling 20s until then, and remember, it's your game, play your way.